Welcome to another episode of the Pennock Knockdown, a podcast where we unpack key strategies and tactics for digital marketing leaders. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest. We've got Ian Chamandy. He is someone with over 20 years experience helping more than 400 organizations define their purpose and become consistently, uniquely remarkable through his proprietary blueprint process. Blueprinting defines an organization's purpose in 7 words or less and uses it to design how it will operate and communicate. Beyond that, Ian has adapted the practice to help individuals who want to create a personal blueprint for a happy, productive, self-directed, and purpose-driven life. He's also an author, speaker, and coach. He co-wrote the book, Why Should I Choose You? Answering the Most Important Questions in Business in 7 Words or Less, which is published by HarperCollins. Ian, so much going on there. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Nikki. I really appreciate being here.
So what are your 7 words or less?
Oh, mine is transforming confusion into clarity.
Transforming confusion into clarity. I love
Yes.
it. So tell us a little bit. I'm hoping you'll unpack that here with this question, which is like, tell us about what you were doing before the 7 words and a little bit how the blueprint business architecture came to life.
Actually, my origin story starts in my very first job out of university. I was a copywriter, and I'm sitting in front of my typewriter,
Wow.
and I'm writing words, and I'm watching them pop up on the paper, and I'm going, "This is dribble. This is insipid. This is cliche driven. This is awful stuff." So I went to a art director, and I said, "Can you make me a sign that says, 'Is this true?'" And then I taped it up on the wall behind my typewriter as a constant reminder to say, are the words on the page true? Are they authentic? Are they organic? The answer was still no. But,
Mhm.
I wasn't meant to be a copywriter. That's why. But the search for is that true became an obsession with me. And it translated into a love of strategic planning. I had a number of careers. I started out in advertising. Then I became a computer consultant to advertising agencies and other companies in the visual communications field. Then I was in television for 15 years. And then 20 years ago, I started this business Blueprint with a business partner. Sadly, Ken died during COVID. He didn't die of
Yeah.
COVID, but he died during COVID. We started out as strategic planners. And over time, that morphed into this really simple process, 3 steps. And I just found the logic of this to be so self-evident. That became my thing. That became my passion, my obsession, my drive. And those 3 steps, I think the single most important strategic asset that any company has is understanding what makes it uniquely remarkable. That one thing at its essence that makes it uniquely remarkable. So if you look at a company like IBM, what was IBM doing after the Second World War? It was selling the most sophisticated business technology to the biggest companies in the world. What's it doing today? It's selling the most sophisticated business technology to the biggest companies in the world. That's 80 years of many generations of management change, many CEOs who had their own idea of how to make IBM thrive. But it was all inside these parameters that kept it on the straight and narrow in the most sophisticated business technology for the largest companies in the world. What is it that's going on inside there? Because it's not articulated. Nobody at IBM can answer that question for you.
Right.
What is it that's going on there that is keeping IBM on this path that has it always leveraging its strengths and people understanding what its value is to them? As I said, I think the single most important strategic asset any company has is knowing what makes it uniquely remarkable. Once you know that, and our standard is to identify that, to articulate it in 7 words or less. But you can do 2 great things once you know what that is. You can use it to design how you're going to operate, and you can use it to design how you're going to communicate. It will guide, as an organization, everything that you do and say from that point on. And as long as it is doing that, then everything that you're doing becomes a manifestation of what makes you uniquely remarkable. And so those 3 steps, identify what makes you uniquely remarkable, use it to design how you're going to operate, and use it to design how you're going to communicate, all your branding, marketing, and sales and that sort of thing. That doesn't happen inside the blueprint, but the guidance for it happens inside the blueprint. That 3-step process is, to me, that's like the single most essential step any company can take.
I feel like we could end the podcast here and be like, we tied it up. That was perfection. Why are so many brands and people getting it so wrong? Like, I feel like it's become so complicated to position businesses, to position people. Like, how do we get so far off track?
Well, this notion of identifying the one thing that makes you uniquely remarkable. Have you ever heard of that in business school? There is not a single business school that values that notion, so they don't teach it. And then in any company that you've worked for or worked with, in this
Mhm.
sort of discussion about what the company is and where it should go and how it should operate and making of strategic plans and that sort of thing. Have you ever heard of that concept raised?
Yeah. No.
That's why. That's why. To me, it is the most fundamental piece in business for any company, and it's not recognized by the business community at all, whether that be academic or the business community in practice. When you can identify what makes you uniquely remarkable. Before that, all of your questions are as you're contemplating options for the future and decisions that you have to make. The question becomes what option is the best option? That's the traditional
Mhm.
way to think. But when you know what makes you uniquely remarkable, the question you ask is, what
Mhm.
option best aligns with what makes us uniquely remarkable? That is a much easier question to ask and answer.
Exactly.
That's part of the value of it. But it becomes a decision-making tool. That's what it's all about. It becomes a decision-making tool for the company. Which we're faced with these 2 options. We're faced with these 3 options. Which one should we take? Which one is most aligned with that one thing that makes us uniquely remarkable? Now, I should just take a moment to create the bridge between what makes us uniquely remarkable and purpose, because you and I started this conversation talking about purpose. What happened was, so Ken and I developed this process, those 3 steps. And then I would say just before COVID hit, I ran into this quote from Pablo Picasso, who said, the artist. And he said, the meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to share it with the world. And I just, as is my wont, I shortened that to, well, your purpose is to find your gift and share it with the world. Now, if you think about what I just explained to you, my process starts with identifying the one thing that makes you uniquely remarkable. It's just a different way of saying your gift.
Yeah.
So I revised the statement once more to your purpose is to discover that one thing that makes you uniquely remarkable, your gift, and then share it with the world. And so that's how I wrapped up this strategic planning methodology in a blanket of purpose.
Yeah.
And so the decision making question now becomes we've got 3 choices. Which one's more aligned with our purpose? And like I said,
Uh-huh.
that's a much easier question to answer than which is the best option for us.
We work with early stage brands making physical product. And what I find in like not the brands we work with, but the handful of brands we talk to every year who are considering working with us is oftentimes they don't have like they maybe there was a moment of arbitrage, maybe they just wanted to see if they could do something better, but like they don't have a uniquely remarkable anything. And so they're kind of backpedaling to maybe fill that gap or maybe fill that gap with like, a handful of options. How do you help those brands?
Well, first of all, I have to respectfully disagree with either you or those brands that come to you and saying that there's nothing that makes them uniquely remarkable. Here's why I'm going to push back on that. I believe that every single company was started for the same reason. And every time I say that, people say, that's ridiculous. How can that be? But I believe every company was started because a person or a group of people said, I know how to do this better.
Mhm.
And they have this thought in their mind about how to do it better. They've worked in the business, they learned all the things that work, they learned all the things that didn't work.
Yeah.
And these people just sort of formulate, oh, I can do it better, but they can't necessarily articulate what's in their head. But the thing is, what's in their head is valuable.
Mhm.
And that's the trick, is taking this fuzzy notion of I can do it better and articulating exactly what that is,
Yeah.
and then shrinking that articulation down to 7 words or less. So it becomes a practical statement that you can use to guide you.
Sometimes when I think of like the work you're doing, and I'd love to kind of understand how you kind of vet the individuals and the businesses you want to work with, because I've struggled to follow protocol, follow processes. So I'm in masterminds and I'm just like, the laziest person there who has some excuse to not do this stuff. Like, what are signs that someone's really going to work well with the blueprint business architecture or not? Like, are there commonalities, or how do you deal with the people like me who like can seemingly never get their stuff together to figure out the 7-word statement?
Well, I don't expect you to be able to do that. That's why I have this business, right? A definition that is there's three qualities to an ideal blueprint client. They're aggressive, they're progressive, and they're well capitalized. So what that means that wherever they are in terms of their growth, they can be a struggling company, they can be a new company, they can be a company that is setting the world on fire, but they want more, want more.
Mhm.
So that's the aggressive. The progressive is you've got to be prepared to go through this process that, in the traditional business community is a bit of an oddball process. And then you've got to be
Mhm.
prepared for non-traditional business outcomes, that you are going to see opportunities for your business that you never saw before because your business definition is just too narrow. I can maybe give you a case study. So it's an actuarial firm. And they came to us and they said, we specialize something that's going to disappear in 5 years. So we don't know where we're going to get sales from next. How do we figure that out? And
Mhm.
I said to them, figure out your purpose, that one thing that makes you uniquely remarkable, and that will answer the question for you. And when they said, okay, let's go, I could have, I almost fell off my chair because actuaries by their nature are generally risk averse. And anyway, they were a fabulous group to work with. My process starts out with you. Tell me in your own words about how you describe your business. Then I can start to see the holes in the logic and the gaps. But after they'd gone on and we'd have a bit of discussion about it, I sort of summarized and I said, okay, so here's what it sounds like. Your clients, the CEO and the CFO, have to make critical decisions now about what big chunks of employee money is going to do in the future. Yep. And I said, and you said you come up with these mathematical models that help the CEO and CFO figure out the right decisions for this money now so that it gets bigger in the future. Right. And I said, and you've given me these three compelling reasons why your mathematical models are better than your competitors. And they said, right. And I said, great. It sounds like you predict the future. And the tops of their heads blew off. No, nobody can predict the future. Nobody can predict the future. And I said, no, but what you can do is you can create a greater degree of certainty
Mhm.
about the future. They balked at that one too, because all they heard was certainty. It's like, oh, no, nobody can do certainty. Nobody, no, a greater degree, a greater degree. And I finally said to them, if you are not providing a greater degree of certainty in the decision making with these mathematical models, what
Mhm.
value are you bringing to the table? And they came around and they really embraced creating a greater degree of certainty as their purpose, as the one thing that made them uniquely remarkable. Now, let's get back to the original question, which is it was something about, non traditional outcomes, right? And I said, when you know your purpose, there's a whole world that opens up. And here's how it opened up for the actuarial firm. When you describe yourself as actuaries, or even worse, their specialty, they specialized in defined benefit pensions. Your world is narrow and getting
Mhm.
narrower by the day. But when you define yourself as creating a greater degree of certainty, all of a sudden you've got greater focus, but that focus broadens the
Uh-huh.
blinkers and you see
Okay.
opportunities for business that were always sitting there. When you had the narrow blinkers on, they were always sitting just outside of your view. And all they did was change the definition of what business they're in. Boom. And blinkers go like that and they go, well, we could help and we could. And so what their plan was, they felt the company name was too wedded to their specialty.
Mm.
And so they decided to create a new company
Hmm.
to have that purpose. And what they were going to do in the first year is they were going to find three customers and they were going to provide the service for free. They're going to say, hey, we're experimenting in this new area and we'll do the work for you for free so that we can learn and you can get value. A few years later, I was interviewing Jill, the CEO for the book, and I reminded her of that. And she said, oh, that's a funny story. We never did it for free. We
Huh.
pitched our story and then they asked us for proposals and we gave them proposals and we did the work and we billed them for it. And
Wow.
yeah, another thing that she told me, they've got a big cube farm there that's where all the employees work. And she said, I walked through the cube farm one day and I couldn't believe the number of people who had printed out the expression, creating a greater degree of certainty, and they just pinned it on the wall in their cubicle. Like they bought into it. And that
Yeah.
is something that is really important for a purpose statement. There's two criteria for it. One is it's got to be so logical that it's self evident. And secondly, it has to resonate on a deep emotional level. And it certainly did with the employees, because she said we created a problem because ever all the employees wanted to work for the new company. They didn't want to work for the old co anymore. I was saying you have to accept non-traditional outcomes, but those outcomes are going to present you with a bounty of sales that you never contemplated before. And so those companies that you're saying that don't have anything uniquely remarkable, what I would say is they just haven't figured it out yet. But there is definitely something.
I love what you're saying, and I think it's like I started this agency 6 years ago, and at first, we were just gonna do direct to consumer, anything that was sold on an e-commerce site, ideally Shopify, we were your team. And over the years, we took people in all different parts of e-commerce business, but we've gotten smaller and smaller into the beauty lane and a little bit of the wellness lane and a couple others on the outlier side. What do you like? So now we're defining our 7-word statement, our purpose to be around the one niche being beauty. What kind of feedback do you have for brands like us? Because I think at the beginning, everyone's like, niche, niche, niche. What are you doing? And I was like, I need volume. We need customers.
What you're talking about is what would happen downstream from a blueprint. Figuring out what markets you want to go after is not dependent on your purpose, but your purpose will shape how you go after those narrower lanes. So you make the decision because of our skill set and because of our interest, we're going into these narrower lanes. Now, what does our purpose tell us about how we have to do that? Because if you went into other lanes in the
Mhm.
communications field, your purpose would apply there as well.
Got it. Okay. That's helpful to understand.
Yeah. What makes you uniquely remarkable allows you to thrive in the lane that you've chosen, but it doesn't pick that lane for you. It does tell you if that lane is consistent with your purpose. And as
Mhm.
long as it is, you could go into beauty, you could go into fashion, you could go into apparel or whatever. But if you started going into trucking, that's probably going to be inconsistent with your purpose.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. Okay, so you kind of talked about the brands that work well. So they're progressive, aggressive, and well capitalized. What are some flyers you've taken where you're like, I don't know, something about this seems like it could work? And like, did you prove it didn't work because they didn't follow that format? Or tell us about some of this, like a wild example.
A wild example. I nerd out on this stuff. So, what I consider as wild and unusual is others would consider boring. So I'm in Canada. The highest fashion retailer in Canada is Holt Renfrew. It's primarily a women's store. Their men's section is something else. But there are women who go in there and they drop $250,000, $500,000 a year,
Wow.
with their private vendors and stuff like that. We did a blueprint with them, so they have got all of the top brands, right? And if you are a woman shopper, that if you want to, the easiest way to get all the top brands is to go to Holt Renfrew. And so their purpose statement became leading style. And leading is both a verb, so
Hmm.
you are the leader, but it's also an adjective in that we have all the leading style brands. It worked in two ways for them. It described what they carried, but it also described what they do, their leadership attitude and style. Yeah, so I was very proud of that one. I tend to be a bit of a hard ass. So the 7 words or less statements are like my children. So I'm not going to say, oh, I love this one more than this one and that sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah.
But that one was a particularly good fit
Yeah.
because everybody knows they're the leader. And so that's all we did. We just reflected that leading style.
That's pretty cool. So to the point too. I love it. That's a great example. Thank you for walking us through that. I guess like my final question, and then I have a fun one for you, hopefully at the end, is like as it relates to changes, maybe like in what's culturally norm, macro shifts, like does that impact the way you approach what you do when like people have to have all these different like hooks and angles and points of view to be live on social 24/7? Like how do some of the changes in the real world impact how you approach the blueprint business architecture?
They don't.
I love it.
They don't, because Holt Renfrew 20 years from now, assuming that it continues to stay alive and thrive, leading style is going to be as relevant 20 and 30 years from now as it
Mhm.
is now. And that's the difference. Often when I say we define in 7 words or less what makes you uniquely remarkable, people say, oh, a value statement or a value proposition or a USP. And it's like, not really. And here's the difference. A value proposition should change because, as you alluded to,
Mhm.
times change, consumers change, the company changes, marketplace changes, all sorts of things. A pandemic happens. And a value proposition for a product or a service has to stay current. So it has to be modified. But a purpose statement doesn't. And I'll
Yeah.
give you an example of one of the first companies ever to publicly state a purpose statement, how successful it was for them. Then they abandoned it. And it was so powerful, it fought its way back. And that's Nike. Up to 1986, Nike was a shoe and apparel company, sports shoes,
Mhm.
sports apparel. And in 1986, and they launched a brilliant ad, which is on the blog on my website, Just Do It. That's Nike's purpose. Nike is committed to the concept of just do it. And all their products and services are all reflections of that. And that
Mhm.
worked for them for almost 3 decades. And then some genius came in and said, I know this is working fabulously for us, but we need to refresh ourselves. And Nike abandoned it for a number of years. And then they just couldn't escape it. It fought its way back, and Nike is back to the Just Do It company. And the beauty of Just Do It is if you really are a Just Do It kind of person, you say, yeah, yeah, that's me. That's me. And if you're the guy watching the NFL game on Sunday afternoon, with your belly sticking out of your shirt and you got Cheeto dust and you're drinking your Colt 45s or whatever, you look at it and you say, yeah, it's me too. I'm a Just Do It kind of person. So whether you are or you're not, you can identify it and fit into that big tent.
Yep. So true. So true. This is great. Ian, my final question for you today is if you were looking back at all the years of experience and starting to do it again as a copywriter who put the is this true on your board next to you, what advice would you give yourself?
Okay, I'm not going to give you the answer that you're expecting.
Okay. Even better.
The answer is quit and go into music. That's my one big regret is that I was a child of the 60s. I grew up with all those great classic rock bands. And it was just always a passion. Music still is. I play guitar, I play a little bit of piano. And my advice to myself would have been quit what you're doing and become a musician.
You probably could have wrote some pretty good music with all of the way you structure and think through things. So I'm sorry that didn't happen, but it sounds like a lot of people are very happy with the path you chose because
I
it's like
landed on my feet.
yes, exactly. Well, Ian, this is super great. We're gonna add in the show notes where people can go check out more. But if you want to leave us with the verbal call out of where they should go, that would be great.
Yeah. So, that, like I said, my standard is that you define your purpose in 7 words or less, right? So, my website is the number seven words.biz.
Great. We will send people over to 7words.biz. Ian, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Nikki. It was fun talking to you.